Hi, folks. It's Thinking Slow. We have an episode today about Ukraine. We're looking at some of the hosing of false information coming out of Ukraine. And in particular, we're looking at one of the main spreaders of that false information, a guy called Anders Aslund. And the reason for doing that is not just for the sake of correcting some facts, but actually to ask a much bigger question about what does all this say about the state of play in our sort of political establishment back in the West, and particularly in Washington, because I think the lack of integrity and the fake news that's being spread actually has quite a lot to say about our own politics, and that raises quite a lot of worrying questions in my view. So here we go then. Here is two recent tweets from the avenging angel of righteousness, otherwise known as Anders Aslund, with his sword of truth coming into in this tweet to suggest that we must take out the Russian President Putin. I don't think anybody denies that his approval ratings are very high inside Russia. I think somewhere about the 70% level, depending on who you believe. But this is an indication of this sort of moral superiority of Mr. Osland that somehow also gives him a moral right to call out for the assassination stroke murder of a leading politician who has, by hook or by crook, been elected and represents a leader of one of the world's largest countries. What gives him this right to call for his assassination, I don't really know, but we're going to look at that. And perhaps the most stomach-churning of all the tweets that he's recently sent out is what is popularly known as doxing, I guess, at the moment, where he is calling out Alina Kabayeva, who is allegedly Mr. Putin's girlfriend, and she has 4 children living in Switzerland. So he's calling out her name, her location, and he acknowledges the fact that there's 4 small children there. Now, given the amount of hate this individual and other individuals are spreading, it's not unreasonable to expect this to result in violence. And I think the idea of intimidating small children in this way is stomach turning. And if we start looking at his hypocrisy now, hopefully you'll agree with me that it is stomach-turning. So, unfortunately for Mr. Osland, the internet doesn't delete anything, and we're going to show you some pretty interesting things that he's put out there. So, this is from as long ago as March 2021, so a year ago, and this is a very, very interesting bit of correspondence. This is started off on the 4th of March 2021, with President Zelensky's press officer tweeting out that they're doing something about corruption in Ukraine. And Mr. Osland, again, the avenging angel of righteousness, comes in with this tweet, very, very surprising. What are you doing, basically, is the message of the tweet. Just making these general statements means nothing. So what is happening with Kolomoisky? Is he still tied to him? So he's suggesting already that the president of Ukraine, who he's now calling a sort of fantastic democratic leader of an independent Ukraine, is actually tied to Kolomoisky. And then he goes on to say, why are all these Kolomoisky stooges still MPs? So he's sort of undermining the sort of democratic credentials of Ukraine. And then this correspondence goes on a little bit where the press officer says, perhaps you're just sour because you've been removed from your position on the board of one of the Ukrainian state companies. And at this point, Mr. Osland blows up in his usual sort of ultra-aggressive way, exclamation marks and commas and question marks. And then, here he's saying outright, I've asked you about Kolomoisky. Why does your boss, i.e. President Zelenskyy, defend the greatest crook in Ukraine, Kolomoisky? Answer, exclamation mark. So again here, Mr. Osland is apparently acknowledging, or at least accusing the president of Ukraine, who he's now defending, of covering for the biggest crook in Ukraine, Mr. Kolomoisky, and acknowledging that the MPs in Parliament are stooges for Mr. Kolomoisky. Now, I think this says a lot about the sort of lack of control that this guy has, sending stuff like this out in public. It's defamatory. It speaks to someone who's not well balanced, to be honest. This is just one of the things that we're going to look at now. Another reason that we did this one today is because Mr. Osland was I think yesterday now, or 2 days ago, tweeting out this video clip, which a number of the talking heads have tweeted out, and using the same message about extraordinary courage. This was tweeted out initially by a completely unknown account from Twitter that's now deleted this video. But what the video shows, and we'll look at at least a frame from it, is some civilians walking peacefully towards soldiers, and those soldiers shouting at those civilians and then shooting up in the air to intimidate the civilians. So there's no text around this tweet, but the implication is obviously these are peaceful Ukrainians approaching Russian soldiers and being intimidated by those Russian soldiers, including by live firing up into the air. Now let's look at the truth, which is the diametric opposite of what Mr. Osland suggests. The truth is actually that this clip was taken not from any time during this war, but from 2017. You can see that here. I've put the link to the whole video. It was doctored in order to take out these identifying marks. And what is really, really astounding is these are Ukrainian soldiers stroke policemen. They're militarized police. And they are pointing their guns at peaceful Ukrainians from the Donetsk People's Republic. And these guys don't blink. It really, truly is astounding when you look at the video. The Ukrainian soldiers stroke police end up firing in the air, and it doesn't stop these people here. So, in classic Goebbels style, accuse the other side of that which you are guilty. These are Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian police, pointing guns at peaceful Ukrainians. Nothing to do with Russia, nothing to do with the war. But nonetheless, tweeted out by Osland and receiving thousands and thousands of likes. And this is the problem we'll get to in social media, that this kind of deceit and dishonesty is well received. It's massively spread throughout the sort of Twitter universe and through TikTok, and people will look at this, they won't understand what's going on, they won't bother to look at it, and they'll get the wrong impression. And the guy that first tweeted this out, who actually doctored the video, has his account set up in a way that you can't respond, so it's impossible to write that this is a fraud and actually put the link to the real video and put the real story in. This is how the dishonest system works, and Mr. Osland is a facilitator and an enabler of that dishonest system. So before leaving this, we need to talk also about power and money, because ultimately, I think everything to do in this war, more or less, is about power and money, almost nothing to do with real principles, and we'll come on to that. But in terms of money, Mr. Osland is very closely associated with Mr. Pinchuk. Now, Mr. Pinchuk happens to be a billionaire, according to Forbes, and by complete coincidence, he is also the son-in-law of the former president of Ukraine, President Kuchma. And he's been involved in dozens of claims and counterclaims, and one of the main claims has been made against him, and we're not commenting on the validity of the claim, we're just stating a claim has been made, revolves around the privatization of Nikopol, which is one of the largest ferroalloy plants anywhere, and it's in Ukraine. The nature of the claim is that it was the privatization of that asset was rigged, so that only President Kuchma's son-in-law could win, and therefore he acquired that asset through privatization at a knockdown price. The claim goes on to say that materials were purchased at an overvalue and product was sold at an undervalue, which effectively means that the cash flows of Nikopol were stripped out via various offshore companies, including through Switzerland. Again, I'm not commenting on the validity of those claims. I'm just saying those claims exist, and I have actually copies of the lawsuits here. And then subsequent to that, there's been now a recent claim in Russia, which has allegedly turned into a criminal case, which is money that was taken from one of Russia's largest insurers called Russia and lent to a related party, of a Cyprus offshore company related to Mr. Pinchuk. That money was then never repaid, leaving Russia with an enormous black hole, which was passed then obviously to all of the policyholders who couldn't get paid out on their insurance policies, and then the Russian state had to step in and make good on those insurance policies. But without commenting on the sort of ins and outs of the various claims, I think it's reasonable to say that this history is far from straightforward. And Mr. Pinchuk then goes on to finance all kinds of think tanks, and then Mr. Osland turns up at those think tanks. That includes the Peterson Institute, that includes the Atlantic Council, and that includes the Yalta European Strategy Group. Now, we've already covered in another video the Atlantic Council and who funds that. That is a combination of sort of oligarchs plus a large chunk of the military-industrial complex. And as we put in the other video, the Atlantic Council has been extraordinarily pro-war and very provocative and aggressive towards Russia. So, this links back into that, basically. This is the other funder. We've already done a video about Mr. Hodorkovsky and his history, but this is the second individual who is funding the Atlantic Council. And just before wrapping up, here is, I think, to me, the epitome of the system at the moment. Here's four of our, let's say at least three of our good friends here. These are our leaders. These are the people that call the shots. This is the oligarchy. Now, you scratch under the surface under any one of these guys, from Epstein to weapons of mass destruction to all these claims and counterclaims. I'm getting to the conclusion that our oligarchy that runs the system are not good guys, basically. I think that's becoming clearer and clearer by the day. So, just wrapping up, I think what I've tried to show is that the people in this sort of deep state Washington establishment are pathologically dishonest. They lie, they don't have any problem with lying. They switch sides, they have basically no principles and no integrity, and that includes Mr. Osland. They also are quite aggressive, so they have their view of how things should be done. As I said, I think that has a lot more to do with power and money than it has to do with principles, and they're very aggressive about forcing that onto other countries around the world, and that's something we heard from the interview with Colonel McGregor. These guys just bully other countries into imposing whatever warped idea of how things should be done onto those nation states. In the case of Russia, it's clear they've been pushing now for a long time for a proxy war. We've done this on another program looking at the RAND strategy from 2019 to unbalance Russia, including by arming Ukraine. This was clearly a strategy, and it's blown up in their faces, I think, to some extent, because it is actually possible that it's now becoming clearer that they're in favor of this war continuing in a way which will bleed Russia. So my conclusion from all of this, essentially, and I've tried to keep this short, is really these ultra-aggressive, I would say, far from honest people that sit in these policy-making groups in Washington, the sort of very unhealthy links between the oligarchy, big business, think tanks and policy setting. That is our problem today. That is a problem for ordinary folk. Ordinary folk, if they're sensible and start looking at what's going on, don't want to give up blood and treasure to be dragged into a war with Ukraine. But these guys do want to drag us. It won't be Anders Aslund fighting. It'll be my son or your son or somebody else's son, or it'll be the inhabitant, the people living in Ukraine. It'll be Russian soldiers. It won't be the guys like Osland who are agitating for war, ultra aggressive and inflaming tensions, doing everything possible to expand this conflict and to prevent a ceasefire happening. These guys are the problem. And having said that, that doesn't mean Russia's a paradise and Putin's a perfect leader, not by any means at all. But certainly the prime driver of this conflict now are these guys like Osland sitting in Washington causing endless trouble for everybody. And of course the real problem is that these individuals have enormous platforms, particularly Mr. Neil, who has tweeted out a number of very misleading statements about Ukraine. And that enormous platform means a lot of people on social media, which is already a toxic environment, are getting propagandized by these false narratives through people who have very little integrity. And this is a cartoon joke, but actually this is a big problem. We're radicalizing people to hate Russia. We're preventing them looking at the ins and outs of this conflict. It's certainly not a black and white conflict, and the longer this goes on, the worse this is going to get. And unfortunately, the more reasonable people who actually investigate and look for themselves and think are going to get dragged in to this ever-increasing conflict, and that is a big problem, and that's why we put these videos up. I'm sure many of our viewers will know many of these things, and this will help them along the way. But if the real problem is we're up against a massive machine that is pushing this war, and it's pushing it dishonestly by spreading lies and putting out false videos like the one we looked at. So that's it for today. The references are here to that material and will be posted up as usual. So thank you very much for listening, and let's hope for the best. Thank you. Bye.